Hello and welcome to Tattva Conversations and Explorations. For our fifth episode on language, we sat down with Professor Anton Treuer. Professor Treuer is Professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University. He has a BA from Princeton University and a MA and Ph.D. from the University of Minnesota. His equity, education, and cultural work has put him on a path of service around the region, the nation, and the world. He has sat on many organizational boards and has received more than 40 prestigious awards and fellowships. His published works include Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask, The Language Warrior's Manifesto, How to Keep Our Languages Alive No Matter the Odds, The Cultural Toolbox, Traditional Ojibwe Living in the Modern World, Warrior Nation, A History of the Red Lake Ojibwe, and many, many more. In this interview, Dr. Treuer talks about what it means to have a conscious thought about language, how different languages reflect our unique way of looking at the world, how colonization affects the languages, cultures, and religions of the world, the tension between cultural continuity and cultural change, as well as the importance of keeping indigenous languages alive. We hope this conversation can help the listeners see the tattva, or the true essence of their own mother tongue, along with the values and meanings embedded within the structures of the different languages of our world and their strong interconnectedness.
Thank you, Professor Treuer, for joining us this evening or morning. It's midnight here, and it's great to have you on Tattva. My first question to you is, as a language revivalist, what can you tell us about approaching language or having a conscious thought about language? How different can a person think about language, and how that would help us?
I think language revitalization work is some of the most important work of our time. You know, each language embodies the unique worldview of a people. And while many humans realize that climate change, for example, poses a real threat to our ecosystems and that we are losing whole species of creatures, that is creating a bit of a bottleneck with the populations, animal, bird, fish populations of planet Earth, people are maybe less well aware that we are also coming to a bit of a bottleneck with bodies of human knowledge and ways of knowing as they are embedded in our languages. Today, there are almost 6,000 languages spoken on the planet. About 2,500 of those languages are highly endangered, tiny handfuls of speakers left. Of all the other languages, you know, there are about 100 that are very widely taught at colleges and universities. And the strength of some of the other languages really depends on what we do to keep them alive right now. You know, even languages like Swedish, which is the official language of a whole country, well supported and wealthy, is in some doubt because almost everybody in Sweden also speaks English. And anytime they interact with anybody outside of Sweden, it's usually in English. And they're very capable of doing that. There aren't nearly as many people publishing in Swedish. And although it might seem to be strong with even those kinds of structural supports, it's in some doubt. Where does that end up a couple hundred years from now? So I think, you know, there are many examples of ways in which different languages reflect our unique way of looking at the world. But, you know, colonization has been really hard on humans. And the idea of colonization is to take one language, one culture, one religion, and supplant all the others, and usually uses violence to accomplish that goal. And of course, solving your problems with violence creates a whole bunch of other problems. So why would we think that all of the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems can be solved by the colonial way of solving problems? Well, they can't. And so embedded in some of these other languages and cultures are different ways to look at the world and to solve problems. And we would all benefit to look at them.
Thank you for that answer, Treuer. The thing that one is led to is, again, to have faith in something that we are not able to see right now. Because if you see the larger world, we are going more into integration, consolidation. We are coming together. We need a common language. How can this idea of going back into individual individual language ideas and identities work along with this idea of togetherness and integration? And because we need for the world to function in a certain way, as you said, it is a way given to us. We need not follow it. But what is the solution in pursuing this identity? How do you see that resulting in a world different from what it is now?
Yeah. So I agree that there is a tension between cultural continuity and cultural change. And there is a tension between integration and separation. And there's actually a value to both. Yes, our global economic systems are increasingly integrated. And there's some movement for some kinds of political integration. That's a little bit slower coming with different kinds of resistance. But you see with even the United Nations and things like this, that there's some effort to try to solve problems collectively. And there's a value to that because, what happens, we saw this with the pandemic, what happens in one little part of the world can affect everybody the whole world over. And that's not just with disease patterns, that's with cultural things, political things, military things, so many things. So we have to be aware of how what we do affects other people and vice versa. At the same time, any great country or collection of countries, I think, are best measured not by their ability to eradicate one another's languages, cultures, and worldviews and have them become homogenous, but by our ability to genuinely support one another's worldviews and languages and cultures. Ultimately, any country has to be big enough to support, value, and humanize both men and women, children and elders. Those kinds of diversity, there's no way to argue that that would not be a good idea, but that would extend to me to, the language diversity within a country, the cultural diversity within a country, that we have a lot to learn from one another. And it's not a requirement to have some kinds of integration, like economic integration. It's not a requirement that we have only one language for the planet or something like that to make that happen. And it is our ability to respect and value one another's differences that really sets us aside, as, more fully humanizing one another. And it keeps the world not just interesting, but it keeps all of the tools in different human ways of knowing at our disposal, as opposed to narrowing the kinds of tools we have for a world in the future that we can only imagine.
How long do you think you need to work as a revivalist, or collectively as revivalists and linguists, to see a world like that where there is diversity, but there is also connectedness and moving forward? What more work and what work is happening now and what more should be done?
Well, there is a lot of work happening now, but there's tremendous pressure on most of the languages in the world. So some of those things are very obvious to most people, like major world governments operate, and militaries, and places that are producing lots of movies and things like that are, much of that work is happening in a minority of the world's languages. But the majority of the world's population is consuming them. A lot of people don't realize this as well, but the biggest predictor of the language that a child will speak is not actually the language of their parents or their school. It's the language of their peers. And this is why, for example, in a country like America, where I live, a family that immigrates, they may speak the heritage language from their country of origin at home with the children. And then when the children go to school, it's an English medium school. And so the kids learn how to speak both languages. But when those kids themselves grow up, since they're conversant in both the heritage language and English, when they actually get married and raise their own children, the peer language for those children is English, and the home language for those children often shifts into English. And so it's very common that it only takes 2 generations, and certainly by 3, most immigrants from a distinct language community end up speaking the dominant language of that country. And of course, countries like England, United States, and so forth, France for a long time, were so busy colonizing the rest of the world, and of course Spain, that these became very dominant world languages. But once established, it doesn't even require, the full force of the colonial apparatus to keep the colonial languages vibrant at the expense of all the others. So as a result, language revitalization takes extra work. If you're working with a language that is not one of the colonial languages, even if it's a widely spoken language, it's got 250,000 speakers or 2 million speakers, it's still often under tremendous pressure, because it doesn't have the same supports, and because even the people from those language communities are inundated in one of the colonial languages. So for example, I work with Ojibwe. It's a Native American language spoken in the Great Lakes region in the United States and Canada. And in some parts of our territory in Canada, everybody's a speaker. They're more isolated communities. You would need a boat or a float plane to get there. But as soon as they get electricity, there's a satellite dish, and kids are watching SpongeBob in English, and English starts to proliferate in those communities. And it's very difficult for someone in one of those communities to go Amish, so to speak, to try to freeze their language and culture at a certain point in time. That's hard for the Amish to do. And so those kind of macro linguistic forces start to envelop us. And certainly that's the case with, in indigenous languages all over the world, but, many other languages too, under a lot of pressure, and it takes special work and interventions to stabilize them. It makes a big difference, even if there are things like target language medium schools. So if there's a school that is going in the language, in my case, indigenous language that we want to keep alive, that really makes a big difference. But even that's not a guarantee. So it's kind of like swimming against the current in a river. You just have to put in a lot of extra effort to cover the same amount of distance that an English speaker who gets to swim with the current downstream would have to navigate. It's worth the extra effort for many, many reasons, but that's just kind of the universe, the language universe as it stands right now.
When you say many, many reasons, I mean, it works for this idea. And what are the reasons? What do you think is the reason? For example, I know that you have mentioned in many places that one of the schools in America which had native language as a medium had a higher percentage of students getting through through their education. So we understand that. I mean, I understand that. But what are the other benefits once they are in the world, and when they have to work with the rest of the world? How does that education in one language help them interact and integrate themselves better and move forward? And how are the students doing now from the university?
Yeah, so these are great questions. So first of all, there are many benefits to learning another language. And they start with what might be a little more clear to people. There's an academic advantage. If you speak more than one language, it enhances cognitive function. It's easier to solve problems and figure things out. It's helpful to children who learn more than one language. That's an academic response. Beyond the academic response, this is something that may be sometimes harder for people from one of the dominant cultures. You know, they are the mainstream to understand, but there's a special difficulty for people from any marginalized group where they will never be fully accepted as being part of the dominant group. Like I have a brown skin, so people will not accept me as a white man, even if I speak academic English very well. And as a result, you know, people from those marginalized groups benefit from having acceptance in their own affinity space, language and culture community. But if that language and culture community is alien to them, they can never be accepted fully in either place. And it drives not just a feeling of angst and separateness, but there is a physiological effect that actually reduces the quality of life for that person. On the other hand, if they get to know themselves and their language community, and they're connected to other people with similar, you know, from the same tapestry, then that helps buoy them and provides positive physiological effects that affect the quality of someone's life and even longevity. So those are additional reasons. Also, you know, as I mentioned briefly, you know, look at colonial systems, you know, that use violence to solve problems. Like, for example, America was really shocked and horrified and hurt after the 9/11 terrorist attack. Well, the impulse was to solve that problem with violence. So we destroyed 2 whole countries, Afghanistan and Iraq, even though there was a single terrorist with a small group of people who was hiding out in Pakistan and had nothing to do with the, you know, either of those countries, that we ended up destroying and occupying for years. That made more problems. You know, we made many enemies. Every single family in Iraq has someone who was killed by American bombs. That didn't make their lives better. That didn't make our lives better. That made things worse. You know, and I think within indigenous languages and cultures, you have some different ways to look at and solve problems that might include restorative justice practices, you know, a communal approach to solving problems that might have more peace-minded solutions, and so forth. And if we eradicate all of those indigenous languages, then we're eradicating those thought patterns and cultural practices, and you have a much smaller number of tools to address the major problems in the world. We will never get to peace by killing all our enemies. We'll find new enemies.
And in native cultures, especially you just mentioned about justice system, communal way of handling or building society or safeguarding societal values, and language is at the center of it. I'm a Tamilian. I speak Tamil, and again, Tamil is a native language of Tamil Nadu. But then we do not have, I mean, I can speak for myself. When the community that I grew up in pushed us towards acquiring the dominant language, because that way we could make our lives better. We could integrate better with the world and have a better lifestyle. And for that reason, we have turned, and the language is currently in a way which is absolutely functional. For example, I can say, I'm hungry, cook me some food in Tamil. And beyond that, if I have to talk to someone on a day-to-day basis, on a regular day, if I have to talk to someone about philosophy, if I have to have a philosophical discussion in Tamil, it is impossible. It is next to impossible, because we do not have terminologies to capture the thought, or when we produce them and speak them, it sounds alien, or from a different time. So in the process, in the last I can clearly see differences that occurred over 10 years, 10-year sections, like the last 10 years and 20 years and 30 years. What has happened is more and more languages have a language. The Tamil language has become something like English, where I can do anything with the language. Language is for the people. So people have power over the language, whereas in your communities, the language has power over people. The language guides and instructs them. So the elders speak in a certain way, or say a word that captures a particular instruction, way of life. Now, it is the opposite. Of course, we do have that too. If we spend time and learn our language or look into our language, we find interesting information, instructions, and that can guide us. But because of the way the world works, we are bound to go after, leave our language and go after the dominant language. Now, in the native culture, language being so central, and could you talk about your language, Ojibwe, and how it drives you, how it inspired you to start your work and do this revivalist work? Because you obviously have seen something that you do not want to keep it to yourself, and you want to share it with the world. So could you speak about your language and community, how language is the foundation or one of the pillars that hold society?
Yeah. So I'll give maybe first a couple examples of maybe how my language has shapes the worldview or way of looking at things. So, for example, in Ojibwe, my language, a Native American language spoken in the Great Lakes region of the United States and Canada, there are words for an elder. Gichiaya'a literally means a great being. Our word for an elderly woman, Mindumuye, means one who holds things together and maybe describes the role of the family matriarch. In English, we have words like old woman, elderly woman, aged woman, and then insulting words like hag or something. And I think in Ojibwe, you don't really have to say respect your elders. It's kind of built right in with any word you could use to talk about them. And so that doesn't mean that we should romanticize or denigrate any language or culture. You know, all of us humans have problems and beauties to our languages and ways. But at the same time, I think there's a very distinct way of holding up and honoring elders. And like, to me, that is reflected in many other parts of our language and culture. So we have this description about like 4 phases of life: babies, young people, adults, elders, and that we pray for people to see all of those seasons, to get to be of advanced years. If a young person does a favor, like a chore for one of their elders, the elder might touch their head and touch the kid's head and say, "Wabikwan bejikiminin, I'm giving you a white hair." And it's a way of saying, you get to be an elder too someday. You're going to get there one good deed at a time. Thank you, and keep going, you know? And as a result, the message becomes that your value is what you give to others rather than what you keep for yourself. And that the goal is to become an elder. And I think in the English-speaking world, we tell people you should be 20 forever, and people dye their hair and get a facelift and a Botox injection. They won't admit how old they really are. They feel shame when they age. And I'm not sure that that's a healthy way to be. And it intersects with sexism, where we tell women your primary value is being young and sexually attractive so you can get a man, because having a man is the only thing that's of value. You know, it's a very unhealthy message. And we tell men that your primary value is getting more money than someone else so you can get a young woman. You know, like it's very, very unhealthy. And I think within some of the world's other languages and cultures, you have some other things that are valued. I certainly see that in the Ojibwe world. And I think that's worth centering. It's one thing, and you can do this well in English, to point out what's wrong with English systems and thought patterns. But if you have nothing to hold in its place, then how can you really shift your thinking and learn from one another, as other people have other ways of doing it? You know, like sometimes English doesn't have vocabulary words for common things, like whatever, Schadenfreude, a German word to receive your laughs at someone else's expense, you know. And you know, so any language might have ways of framing or looking at things that can give us perspective and be worth keeping.
When you look at the colonizers, when they went out to take other land, but before they went, they also had to do another step before moving out, which was to homogenize the language of the land. So my question to you is, do languages, I mean, of course, in a way I can guess what you would say, but I would like to learn from you the points that you are going to make. Do languages, or can languages live forever? Or is there a shelf life to languages? Because we have seen languages die. In India, we have about 1,600 and odd languages spoken, but none of them are on record. It was done as a survey was conducted sometime about 30 years or 40 years ago. And currently we have on record, we have much less than that. And currently we have, politically, we have a kind of a goal to have one language across the country so that we can function better and participate in global affairs with much more vigor and strength.
Well, first of all, as long as there are two human beings in the same space, they will have a language. So languages are intrinsic to the human condition, but all cultures and all languages are always changing. That's inescapable. So, the English language as it is spoken now has only been around for like 600 years. I don't know if you tried to read Geoffrey Chaucer. He's like one of the first people to publish in English. That was 600 years ago. I can barely read that, and I think my English is pretty good. So languages, and that's a language that is widely spoken and written and studied. So languages are constantly changing. There's no way to freeze one in time successfully. However, while languages, necessarily have to change, like even in English, a word like firewall or motherboard might have terrified somebody 30 years ago, and today it's common vocabulary, So we need to have lexical expansion as our environments and technologies shift and change too. But at the same time, that languages are always undergoing change. I think a language continuum, where, English being informed by its Germanic kind of Celtic roots and, influences from Romance languages and many others, speak to a unique English worldview, that Ojibwe, even though there have been and will be influences from other historical environments, experiences, and contact with other groups of people, that's understandable, and it does not diminish the beauty or importance of that language, that it's still worth continuing, and that the ways of thinking and solving problems there are very much worth it as well. In our language too, if you look at the words we have for ourselves, parents, children, grandparents, grandchildren, when you get to great-grandparent and great-grandchild, the word, Anikobijigan, it literally means my line. And it's the same word for both. So that spans 7 generations. And we're often told to think in terms of 7 generations, like 7 generations in the past, someone was thinking of us, praying for us, making decisions about politics, economics, whatever, to try to set us up to have the best possible life we could. And we should make decisions today, thinking 7 generations ahead down our line on a Kobijigan, so that our future generations, 7 generations from now, they won't know my name, but they might know my language and they might know my culture. Granted, it will be evolving and slightly different from the one that I carry, but that will be a gift to them if they have that, because it will equip them with tools to solve problems, a unique worldview that can connect them to one another and distinguish themselves from others, that it will be a tool that will improve the physiological impacts of living in whatever environment they live in, that will improve their psychological frame for being okay in their own bodies, with their own culture, not have to pretend that they are someone that they are not, or be evaluated based upon how well they can pretend to be white English speakers or whatever, even though they'll never be fully accepted as that. Even understanding that things like race are a human construct, not a biological certainty. So there's a great value to that, that these shifting, changing languages continue and continue to exist, but continue to evolve as our environments evolve and change, knowing that my children, 7 generations from now, my future generations down that line will have different circumstances, different challenges, perhaps different blessings that they can, and strengths that they can call upon. But ultimately, it'll be a great benefit if they can have what's in our language toolbox at their disposal.
That brings me to the question of evolution of Ojibwe. Could you talk about little about the recent changes? Because I have something very interesting that is going on in Indian languages, which is a way of integrating English into the native language. So there is there is a pattern that has evolved where we use our native word for the verb do as an auxiliary for the English verb. You know, the word do in Tamil is pannu, and this pannu conjugates, and the English verb stays as an imperative. So cook pannu, when I say cook pannu, I'm asking you to cook. Cook pan rain says that I am cooking, because Tamil is a verb final language and the verb conjugates. That's the last ending. So the last part, the verb termination, actually informs us the subject who is speaking. So how the verb terminates tells me who's speaking. So pan rain means I am doing, first person singular. Pan ra means you are doing. I mean, he is doing. Pan re means you are doing. Pan ranga means they are doing. So we have evolved this. I don't know who did it. I don't know if there is a record. I'm sure if we look into it, we might find something interesting. But this is extraordinary. Like I can say in Tamil, I'm saying a Tamil sentence. Na cook pan re. Na I'm cooking. Na wait pan re. I'm waiting. Na call pan re. I'm calling. So this is something that I've seen in my language, and I've seen in other Indian languages, and it is the same. In Hindi, the word karo, which is do, gets attached as an auxiliary to the English verb. Main cook kar raha hoon. I am cooking. Main wait kar raha hoon. I am waiting. Main call kar raha hoon. I am calling. So I want to know, and all of this happens not because of a dominant oppressive thing, but a force, but things like advertising, songs, jingles, ad jingles, and these things are constantly, we are surrounded by these things, and our language changes. Especially in Tamil Nadu, where I come from, there was a huge resistance to Hindi. But then nobody protested when Hindi came to us through movies. And in about 10 years, I see a lot of Hindi words in Tamil. And people don't know. I teach children here in the local village. And if I ask them to give me 5 Tamil words, the 5 Tamil words are ball, bat, school, bag, pen. None of them are Tamil words. In their head is Tamil words. Yeah. So this is what I see in around me, and I want to know what you see in Ojibwe and how it is evolved. What are the threats to it?
Yeah. So first of all, because nobody lives in an language community that is completely walled off from the rest of the world, it's very difficult to orchestrate that. Even very remote communities in the Arctic, in the Alaskan wilderness, or maybe way down in the Grand Canyon, Havasupai, some of the others, they're still not language isolates that are completely protected. There might be very few, like way out in the Amazonian rainforest, that have been pretty isolated, but for most of us, once we're watching the TV, once we're interacting with the rest of the world, then there's no way to like purify a language and avoid any exchanges. Like Honestly, even the English language has at least 20 words it borrowed from Ojibwe, because we're in touch with each other. So that includes words like totem, toboggan, muskeg, moose, and so forth, that are Ojibwe words that made their way into English. So that's just something natural that humans will do. The French are kind of famous for setting up an institute to try to throw out the foreign words, and they're trying to purify their language, but it just does not work, and frankly, French has Gaelic roots, plus was colonized by Rome. It's almost like a Creole creation to French to begin with, and it's still borrowing lots of words from Arabic, from English, from lots of other languages. So it's almost a silly endeavor, but they're trying. With Ojibwe, we have the same dynamics, where there might be a cognate that is borrowed, even from early fur trade times from French, or more recently from English. So there are some of those. And sometimes it's like we have our word for coffee, Makade Mashkiki Wabu, which means black medicine water. It's got all Ojibwe roots. But there's another word, gapi, which is a loan word from coffee. We don't have an F sound in Ojibwe. And so sometimes people will use gapi instead of Makade Mashkiki Wabu because it's cute, or something like that, even though both words are operative. But if you keep going long enough with the cuter short word, then eventually that becomes the word. And this is how languages shift and change. So we do deal with that process. Although one of the things that's kind of interesting for Ojibwe is that the morphemes, the smallest meaningful parts of words, tend to be more commonly known to everyday speakers. So as a result, creating new words without having to borrow them is a little bit easier. So when we saw a television, someone said, "Oh, Mazanate Sijagan," that's a box that reflects an image through light, all using Ojibwe morphemes, and it was easy to create that word. And so a lot of our lexical expansion has happened with Ojibwe roots, but it's not like a pure process, and we do have cognates. And, even the Ojibwe language as it's spoken now is probably different from a few hundred years ago, and different again from 1491. Linguists who study this, will talk about Proto-Algonquian, like the mother group that we came from, and we had even sounds in that language that are different from what we use now. That doesn't mean they are less than, or we are less than, or something like that. It's part of the natural process of language shift. But it's good to be thoughtful about it. And that I'm not like a language purist, like it's wrong to take any loan word. But at the same time, I think we can be thoughtful about how we do, and intentional about how we do lexical expansion, so that, it strengthens the indigenous underpinnings of our language.
And that brings me to the next question. How does approaching language more than just as a medium of communication do to the individual and society? You were talking about approaching language from slightly higher perspective, slightly more, I don't know, for the lack of a better word, spiritual angle to it. So how does that impact both the individual and the society?
Oh, yeah. So we have many applications for our language. Of course, it's social. It can be political. Like for us, we fight for our tribal sovereignty, our right to rule ourselves, and having distinct languages and cultures is part of the argument. It's, in addition to social and political, it can be economic, academic, but also spiritual. And it's not just that we run our ceremonies or a traditional funeral exclusively in our tribal language, although that is the case. But it's also that important cultural and spiritual concepts are reflected in our language that are best understood that way. So for example, when we do our indigenous naming practices, the parents don't actually pick the name for their child. They pick spiritual leaders, elders, and so forth to be namesakes, they're kind of like godparents in some other traditions, spiritual guide, role model. And then they speak about dreams or visions that they had that inform a name. And someone might receive several names. And so at the naming ceremony, like the word we have for my body, Niyao is my body, and my namesake is Niyawe'e. So Niyao, Niyawe'e. And you can hear the word is the same at the beginning, Niyao, Niyawe'e. And so essentially it evokes this concept that our body is a cup. It's a temporary housing for our soul. And other things can go in the cup too, including our native names and so forth. So if I were to give a name to someone, I'm going to take something out of my cup and put it into someone else's. So this is Niyao and this is Niyawe'e. It's all built in a word. And so you reflect this important spiritual or cultural concept just by using the language and just how we speak to one another, or the terms of relation that we have for one another, expresses that affinity in a way that's difficult to translate, without a few paragraphs to supply some meaning for it. So, there are many other concepts like that too. We don't even have a word for goodbye. It's just Gikawabaman, I'll see you again. Like, you're a soul, I'm a soul, I'll see you again this world or the next, And so it's kind of an affirmation of another person when parting, and doesn't have the equivalent of goodbye like it would in English.
When people say these words today, when young people speak these words, are they aware of this essence of the word, that the essence that it carries? Or even in our language, in the language that I speak, many words contain, it's compressed, bite-sized information of an instruction, but we don't even get to the essence because we do not have the time. We just speak it.
Right.
For example, the word God for us is kadawul. Kada is to be or to lie, to be still. Kada is lie, and ul is inside. To lie inside, to be inside is the word. Kadawul, God, that is God. So, but we don't, unless and until I am looking at it, I don't get it. So I want to know, you as a teacher, as a person who interacts with Ojibwe on a day-to-day basis, like you do that for a living also, but how is it spoken in homes and in the society? How most the young people, when they say this word, do they understand it? Is it a ritual? Do they see that as a ritual and do it?
Yeah, so it's probably a bit of both. A lot of words are just what you're referring to. It's just a TV, and they're not thinking a box that reflects an image through light, the whole morphological description. So some of those deeper underpinnings might be lost on some of the speakers, or at least less thought about. But I do think that a language like Ojibwe makes it just a little bit easier than some to access that, because it's a polysynthetic language. Like those parts are more commonly known to everyday speakers. So it's a little bit easier, even if I made up a word, like there was a new technology or a new food item that I'd never seen before, and I just made up a word that described it. Someone from 1,000 miles away who is in a totally different part of Ojibwe country would probably still understand it, because they'd still understand what I'm describing, and they'd be able to make that association. But the more loan words you take in from other languages, and the less that some people maybe are aware of those morphemes, then the less of that meaning is conveyed. So I'd say it's a little bit of both, like the process of disassociating the deeper meanings is there, but it's not just academics, who will understand that. Like, I don't know, in English, a word like sarcasm, coming from Latin, sarc, meaning flesh, chasm, to tear, most English speakers might not know those roots, but a few do and can appreciate the deeper meaning there. I just think that's a little bit more common that everyday speakers would know a little more of that in Ojibwe, but maybe not all of it, and especially as we take in more cognates, from other languages, then, that makes it harder to do too.
Professor Treuer, it was a pleasure talking to you this evening, and we hope to have more sessions on language, especially to learn more about Ojibwe in the future. We are, my wife and I have started exploring your dictionary, your resources. So we are interested in learning more, and there are more questions. But definitely, we hope to meet you again on Tattvadeep to have a more detailed conversation, to understand more about Ojibwe. We thank you for your time.
Thank you. Yeah, a pleasure to be in conversation with you, and thank you for all your work.
Our conversation with Professor Treuer helped us appreciate the important role that languages play in helping us create a healthy and wholesome worldview, and how helping revive dying and dormant languages makes the world interesting. But more importantly, it helps us keep intact all the tools in different ways of knowing, and that narrowing down the languages we speak means losing important fundamental knowledge that our future generations may need more than we can imagine. It will be wonderful to know your thoughts on the interview, and if it inspired your worldview in any way. Thanks for being here. We will see you soon with another interesting mind, demystifying another interesting topic. Until then, take care.